Let's be honest, the 1960s gave us cartoons that would have censors, advocacy groups, and watchdogs foaming at the mouth if they aired today. Back then, TV was the Wild West. Animators pushed boundaries, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose, and nobody stopped to ask, wait, is this okay for kids? So buckle in, because we're diving into the kind of shows that make you laugh, cringe, and wonder how they ever got on air. The Funny Company, 1963 to 1965. If ever there was a cartoon that proved good intentions can pave the road straight to disaster, it was The Funny Company. On paper, the pitch sounded uplifting, children from all walks of life working together to solve problems and celebrate diversity. Sounds wholesome, right? In practice, it became one of the most tone-deaf, stereotype-riddled messes ever broadcast to American kids. The characters weren't representations. They were walking, talking cliches so blunt, they almost felt like parodies written by people who had never actually met anyone from another culture. Jasper, the African-American boy, spoke only in rhyme and had a bizarre obsession with, you guessed it, watermelon. Mary Twitter, the shy Asian girl, existed to bow politely, giggle on command, and solve every math problem in sight. And let's not forget Pterodactyl, the so-called prehistoric bird, voiced with an over-the-top Mexican accent, whose main contribution was napping in sombreros. This wasn't diversity. This was lazy caricature masquerading as progress. The writers genuinely thought they were breaking new ground. What they really did was throw a spotlight on every outdated stereotype in the book. And it didn't stop there. Between the slapstick antics, episodes included educational interludes about different world cultures. If you tuned in for the Africa episode, you got mud huts and endless tribal dancing. Mexico, donkeys, sombreros, and mariachi riffs. Asia, dragons, fortune cookies, and mystical wisdom that sounded like it was made up 5 minutes before the script deadline. Viewers didn't let it slide. Advocacy groups like the NAACP and Congress of Racial Equality slammed the show. And by the 5th episode, CBS stations in big cities were already pulling it off the air. Ironically, some southern stations kept airing it proudly, proving just how out of touch things really were. The final blow came with a so-called very special tolerance episode that was supposed to mend fences. Instead, it doubled down on every offensive stereotype the show had already built, practically mocking the very idea of acceptance. The result? A train wreck that became a case study in how not to do representation. The creator defended the show to his dying day, claiming it was all about unity. History disagrees. The Funny Company didn't unite anyone. It showed just how dangerous diversity can look when it's written by people who don't understand it. If there's a Mount Rushmore of cartoons that would never, ever make it past today's gatekeepers, this one's carved right into the center. Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse, 1960 to 1962. Now, imagine Batman stripped of his gravitas, reimagined as a cat, and let loose in a fever dream where every crime-fighting gadget doubles as a weapon of mass destruction. That's Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse. And here's the kicker. It was created by Bob Kane, the same man who helped give us Batman. You'd think he'd lean towards satire. Instead, he leaned straight into cartoon chaos that would make any parent in the 21st century reach for the off button. The show followed Courageous Cat and his sidekick, Minute Mouse, as they patrolled Empire City. Sounds innocent enough until you realize Courageous Cat wasn't armed with clever gadgets. He carried a cat gun. This wasn't some comic contraption. This gun fired everything from smoke bombs to literal ice bullets and explosions. You'd see villains get knocked around, bones cracking, walls collapsing, and the kind of reckless violence that would have watchdog groups filing lawsuits today. The worst part? Kids loved it. Naturally, they started building their own makeshift cat guns out of whatever they could find. Sticks, pipes, rubber bands, you name it. Teachers complained about students acting out courageous cat scenarios on the playground, complete with mock gunfights and improvised explosions. Suddenly, this kids' parody was fueling a wave of dangerous playtime reenactments, and it wasn't just the weapons. Courageous Cat himself was hardly a role model. He was arrogant, reckless, and often seemed to enjoy the chaos he caused more than the justice he supposedly served. Entire city blocks would collapse during his battles, and more than once, Empire City looked worse off after he saved the day. Minute Mouse, the loyal but underpowered sidekick, often played the voice of reason, but Courageous Cat never listened. The result was a trail of flattened buildings, terrified civilians, and questionable moral lessons. What's fascinating is that the show also slipped in inside jokes about the comic book industry. References went right over kids' heads, but left adults wondering who exactly this show was for. Was it parody, satire, or just a superhero cartoon gone off the rails? The answer didn't matter. By the early 60s, parent protests mounted, teachers rallied against it, and networks realized they had unleashed something they couldn't control. Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse stands today as a bizarre footnote in animation history, proof that even a superhero spoof can lose its way when violence and questionable morals outweigh the humor. Batman might have been dark, but at least he had purpose. Courageous Cat? He was pure chaos dressed in a cape, and that's exactly why it wouldn't stand a chance today. Batfink 1966 to 1967. Your bullets cannot harm me, my wings are like a shield of steel. That was Batfink's battle cry, and if you grew up in the 1960s, you probably remember it. On the surface, Batfink looked like harmless parody, a campy spoof riding the coattails of Batman's popularity. But dig deeper, and you find a cartoon stuffed with stereotypes, tone-deaf sidekicks, and jokes about nuclear war, all packaged for children. No way this would clear modern broadcast standards. Let's start with the sidekick, because that's where jaws really drop. Batfink's partner was Karate, an Asian character whose entire personality boiled down to broken English, endless bowing, and poorly delivered martial arts gags. He wasn't a character, he was a punchline. Every time Karate spoke, you could practically hear the writers chuckling at their own offensive caricature. Imagine pitching that to a network today. You wouldn't even make it through the front door. Then there were the villains. Instead of original bad guys, Batfink leaned hard on Cold War stereotypes. One episode featured Hugo Agogo, a mad scientist who mashed together every foreign menace trope you can think of: wild accents, vague threats about global domination, and a look that felt equal parts European and Asian, like a cartoon checklist of the other. The message to kids was clear: scary foreigner equals evil. And if the cultural insensitivity wasn't enough, Batfink also had a talent for joking about real-world fears. Case in point, the atom boom, an episode that literally turned nuclear weapons into a gag. Remember, this was the 1960s. Kids were doing duck and cover drills at school. Parents were reading headlines about missile crises. Yet, here was a children's cartoon tossing nukes into a slapstick punchline. Talk about poor timing. Parents started complaining almost immediately. Advocacy groups soon followed, with letters, protests, and boycotts stacking up until NBC affiliates began pulling episodes from their schedules. By 1967, Batfink was quietly buried, with most prints destroyed or shoved into storage. Only a few bootleg episodes survive today, passed around by animation collectors who can't believe it was ever greenlit in the first place. The legacy of Batfink? A cautionary tale about how parody can cross into parody of good taste itself. Sure, his wings of steel might stop bullets, but they couldn't shield him from the backlash that was waiting just around the corner. The Adventures of Pow Wow. If you want to see how not to handle cultural representation, look no further than The Adventures of Pow Wow. This cartoon was marketed as educational, supposedly giving kids a glimpse into Native American traditions. What it really did was mash together every lazy stereotype Hollywood had ever created and serve it up as Saturday morning programming. The main character, Pow Wow, was a young Native American boy who lived in a teepee, spoke in broken English, and wore a mishmash of tribal clothing that had no basis in any real und culture. His adventures were built around lessons from the Great Spirit, smoke signal messages, and the kind of mystical animal conversations you'd expect from a Western written in the 1930s. To make things worse, The writers pulled from a hodgepodge of cultural symbols, headdresses, totem poles, chants, and dumped them all together as if Native Americans were one monolithic cartoon tribe. And it didn't stop there. The show included little educational interludes designed to teach kids facts about Native people. Only most of those facts were completely wrong. Kids learned that all Native Americans lived in teepees, had no written language, and practiced the same traditions coast to coast. In other words, it was misinformation disguised as learning. From the moment the show hit the airwaves, Native advocacy groups were outraged. The Bureau of Indian Affairs even stepped in, condemning the cartoon as not only inaccurate but outright damaging. Things hit another level when Native American veterans voiced their anger. Men who had served their country in World War II and Korea were watching their culture turned into a caricature for laughs. That stung. Stations in major cities quickly dropped the show, but some rural affiliates stubbornly kept it on the air for years. The damage, however, was already done. Instead of educating children, the Adventures of Pow Wow reinforced harmful stereotypes that lingered for decades in pop culture. Today, the cartoon is remembered not as a relic of nostalgia, but as a prime example of what happens when representation is handled by people who don't understand or respect the culture they're depicting. Educational? Not even close. If anything, it educated audiences on how deeply television could fail when nobody was paying attention. Sinbad Jr. and His Magic Belt, 1965 to 1966. What could possibly go wrong with a cartoon about a young adventurer with a magic belt that gives him super strength? According to Hanna-Barbera, absolutely everything. Sinbad Jr. and His Magic Belt was supposed to be a fun modernization of the legendary sailor's adventures. Instead, it became a train wreck of cultural stereotypes, so clumsy it actually drew the attention of the U.S. State Department. Here's the setup. Sinbad Jr. and his wisecracking parrot, Salty, traveled the globe, tackling villains and exploring exotic lands. Sounds like harmless fantasy until you notice that every single location was painted with the broadest, most insulting brushstrokes possible. Middle Eastern characters wore turbans and rode camels while wielding futuristic gadgets. Entire fictional countries were written as backwards or hostile, with caricatured accents so over the top they bordered on parody. Hanna-Barbera thought they were sidestepping controversy by inventing fake nations. They didn't realize they were just doubling down on the problem, because every made-up land still leaned on stereotypes audiences immediately recognized. And as tensions in the real Middle East played across news broadcasts, advocacy groups weren't about to let it slide. Arab American organizations condemned the cartoon for reinforcing negative images of their culture. Letters of protest poured in. Boycotts were organized, and sponsors grew nervous. Things escalated so badly that even the U.S. government weighed in. The State Department worried that Sinbad Jr. could actually damage foreign relations. Imagine that. A Saturday morning cartoon making headlines at the diplomatic level. Hanna-Barbera scrambled to save face. They tried rebranding the show as pure fantasy, insisting it had nothing to do with real cultures. But the protests didn't stop, and by 1966, networks quietly yanked the series. Embarrassed, Hanna-Barbera practically disowned it, later acting like it never existed. Today, Sinbad Jr. and His Magic Belt is nearly impossible to find. Most episodes have been buried so deep they may as well have been launched into orbit. Its lasting legacy isn't the magic belt or the swashbuckling adventures. It's the lesson that when you play fast and loose with culture for entertainment, the fallout can be far more powerful than anything a cartoon hero can handle. Hot Wheels, 1969 to 1971. Sometimes the most controversial cartoons aren't the weird ones. They're the ones that seem obvious in hindsight. Hot Wheels is Exhibit A. On paper, it looked like a slam dunk. Mattel's die-cast cars were flying off store shelves. Kids loved racing them on plastic orange tracks. So, why not give them a cartoon where the cars come to life? Sounds like easy Saturday morning fun, right? Wrong. The show followed Jack Wheeler, a clean-cut hero who loved racing, and his friends as they zoomed around in customized cars. Every week brought wild stunts, flashy competitions, and even half-baked mysteries, all tied together with lessons about safe driving and teamwork. But here's the kicker. Every single car on the show was a real Hot Wheels model you could buy in the store that same week. Every single one. It didn't take long for parents to figure it out. What looked like a cartoon was actually a 30-minute commercial beamed straight into their living rooms. Kids begged for the cars they'd just seen on TV. Parents coughed up the cash. And advocacy groups realized something was very wrong. Letters flooded the FCC, accusing ABC and Mattel of disguising advertising as children's entertainment. That wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. A whistleblower later confirmed the worst. Internal memos revealed the show was designed first and foremost to sell toys, with phrases like narrative vehicle for product placement scribbled right into the planning notes. The backlash was huge. Competitors like Matchbox and Johnny Lightning lobbied regulators, furious that Mattel was getting free TV advertising disguised as storytelling. The FCC cracked down hard in 1971, ruling that Hot Wheels violated children's programming rules. ABC was fined, Mattel was banned from producing TV content for years, and new regulations were born to prevent toy companies from ever trying the same stunt. Here's the irony. The controversy only made the toys more popular. Kids still wanted them, maybe even more because of the ban. But the cartoon itself, dead on arrival. Today, Hot Wheels is remembered less as entertainment and more as the moment Saturday morning cartoons collided headfirst with consumer protection laws. If you've ever wondered why toy-based cartoons like Transformers or G.I. Joe came with heavy disclaimers in the 80s, thank Hot Wheels. It was the crash that forced networks to finally install seatbelts. The Beagles, 1966 to 1967. You couldn't escape Beatlemania in the mid-1960s. The Fab Four were everywhere, on the radio, in films, even in a Saturday morning cartoon. So, naturally, TV executives thought, why not make another band-themed cartoon with dogs? Thus, the Beagles was born. And what followed was one of the strangest, most ill-fated attempts to cash in on pop culture ever broadcast. The stars were Stringer and Tubby, two canine musicians with mop-top wigs and songs that sounded suspiciously familiar. Each week, they'd stumble into a new misadventure, strumming guitars, singing tunes, and wandering into groovy animal clubs that looked suspiciously like smoke-filled underground lounges. The vibe was psychedelic, the colors trippy, and the dialogue filled with winks toward expanding your mind. Not exactly subtle. Kids loved the music. Adults immediately noticed the not-so-hidden references to counterculture, and before long, complaints came pouring in. Parents accused the show of normalizing the drug culture sweeping America. Religious groups slammed it as dangerous, claiming it promoted strange behavior. And to top it all off, the Beatles themselves, or at least their lawyers, stepped in, furious that the Beagles' original songs sounded like parodies of real hits. CBS quickly realized it was cornered. On one side, parent groups were up in arms. On the other, they were staring down a legal storm from the world's biggest band. By the end of the season, the show was gone. Only 26 episodes were ever produced, and in a brutal twist of fate, most were destroyed in a 1970s vault purge. Today, only fragments of the Beagles survive, stuck in legal limbo and passed around by collectors like rare artifacts. And while the cartoon itself has mostly vanished, its legacy remains as a perfect snapshot of the 1960s, an era where TV execs tried anything to chase a fad, even if it meant dressing dogs in wigs and sneaking in psychedelic vibes. It's proof that sometimes chasing the cool of the moment just makes you look hopelessly uncool in the long run. Space Angel, 1962 to 1964. Some cartoons are weird because of their plots. Others are weird because of their visuals. Space Angel managed to be both, and in a way that scarred an entire generation of kids. Broadcast from 1962 to 1964, this space adventure followed Scott McCloud, aka Space Angel, and his crew aboard the Stardust as they battled cosmic threats. Standard space opera stuff, until the characters opened their mouths. Instead of animating lip movements, the producers used a process called synchro vox. Translation: they pasted actual human lips onto otherwise static cartoon faces. The result was as uncanny as it sounds. Imagine a drawing of a stiff-faced astronaut suddenly sprouting floating human lips that move in real time. For some kids, it was hilarious. For others, it was nightmare fuel. The plots weren't much better. The writers borrowed from pulp science fiction, time travel, alien invasions, robot uprisings. But the stiff animation and creepy lip-syncing made even ordinary stories feel surreal. At times, it was less like watching a cartoon and more like staring into a fever dream set in outer space. Critics couldn't decide if it was cutting edge or just plain lazy. Parents called it odd. Kids either laughed uncontrollably or refused to watch alone. And then came the long-term effect. Some viewers swore the disembodied lips haunted them, following them even after the TV was turned off. Teachers complained that the show's pacing was so awkward, it distracted kids from paying attention to anything else. By the mid-1960s, networks quietly pulled it from rotation. Yet, despite its creep factor, Space Angel built a cult following. Fans loved the jazzy music, sleek ship designs, and sheer audacity of trying something so bizarre. Today, it's remembered less for its storytelling and more for those haunting Synchrovox mouths, a reminder of a time when TV producers were willing to experiment with anything, no matter how unsettling. In the end, Space Angel wasn't just a space adventure. It was a surreal trip into the uncanny valley, proof that even in the 1960s, animation could leave you wondering whether you just watched a kid's show or a bad dream. Dodo, the Kid from Outer Space, 1965 to 1970. At first glance, Dodo, the Kid from Outer Space, looked like harmless sci-fi fun. A wide-eyed alien comes to Earth to learn about human life. Sounds wholesome, right? But once you actually sat down to watch it, you realize this wasn't education. It was surreal chaos masquerading as a children's cartoon, and it left kids more confused than enlightened. Dodo was a tiny Martian with giant eyes and a knack for pulling gadgets out of thin air. Need to fix a problem? Out came a reality-warping ray gun, a cloning machine for your pet cat, or an umbrella that literally bent the laws of gravity. The so-called lessons started normal, basic science stuff, like explaining rainbows or magnets, but quickly spiraled into absurdity. One minute you were hearing about Earth's atmosphere. The next, Dodo was solving math problems by changing the speed of light. Parents expected something safe, maybe even mildly educational. What they got were hyperactive visuals, relentless sound effects, and plots that loop back on themselves like an Escher staircase. Teachers began noticing kids parroting bizarre facts they picked up from the show. Some believed Martians were real. Others thought you could fix broken toys by altering molecular polarity. Educators started calling the cartoon psychedelic propaganda and warned it was warping kids' sense of reality. And the pacing, completely unhinged. Characters yelled over each other, sound effects bombarded viewers nonstop, and episodes often ended without any real resolution. Kids either loved it for the chaos or sat bewildered, unsure what they'd just watched. Rumors spread among parents that the show was sneaking subliminal messages into the animation, though no one ever proved it. By the late 60s, networks had had enough. Dodo was quietly pulled from syndication, though it lingered in some markets thanks to its small but loyal fan base. Collectors today still trade grainy recordings, fascinated by its sheer weirdness. The legacy of Dodo, the Kid from Outer Space, isn't that it taught science. It's that it showed how wildly off the rails educational programming could go when no one was paying attention. Instead of teaching kids about Earth, it convinced them the universe worked like a carnival funhouse. For a show that claimed to be about learning, that's one cosmic fail. The Mighty Heroes, 1966 to 1967. If you thought superheroes were supposed to be brave, competent, and inspiring, the Mighty Heroes turned that expectation on its head and stomped on it for good measure. Created by Ralph Bakshi, the same animator who would later push boundaries in the 70s and 80s, this cartoon assembled a team so hopelessly incompetent they were almost villains by accident. The lineup was pure absurdity. Diaper Man, a literal baby wielding a bottle as a weapon. Rope Man, whose body was just rope. Strong Man, who couldn't control his own strength. Tornado Man, who spun himself dizzy. And Cuckoo Man, who couldn't even fly in a straight line. Together, they were supposed to defend the city of Good Haven. In reality, they spent most episodes saving themselves from the disasters they caused. Plots were predictable but hilarious. A villain would appear, the heroes would leap into action, and then promptly make things worse. Rope Man tied himself in knots, Strong Man punched holes in the wrong buildings, and Tornado Man's whirlwinds usually destroyed more property than the bad guys ever could. Entire episodes became about fixing their own mistakes instead of actually stopping crime. Parents weren't amused. They complained that the show rewarded incompetence instead of bravery, and educators worried kids would imitate the bumbling antics. TV watchdog groups wondered aloud if the cartoon was actually satirizing children's television itself. Was it parody or just reckless slapstick? Disguised as superhero fun? The pacing made things even stranger. Characters shouted over one another, backgrounds bent and warped in Bakshi's surreal style, and jokes flew so fast, half of them didn't even make sense. Some kids loved the anarchy. Others were left scratching their heads, overwhelmed by the noise and confusion. The Mighty Heroes lasted only one season, vanishing almost as quickly as it appeared, but its cult following endured, especially among fans who saw it as a precursor to Bakshi's more experimental work. In hindsight, the show feels like a parody of superhero culture years before superhero parody became a thing. But if you aired it today, parents would storm networks for pushing a team of diaper-clad and disaster-prone heroes who glorified chaos more than justice. Sometimes the joke goes too far, and the Mighty Heroes is proof. So there you have it. 10 cartoons from the 1960s that would never make it past a single episode if they aired today. From cultural stereotypes to toy-selling schemes, from nightmare visuals to reckless heroes, these shows prove the 60s were both fearless and clueless when it came to children's programming. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe, because we've only scratched the surface of TV's strangest forgotten gems.